Welcome to Reuters Next. I'm Matthew Green, climate correspondent based in London, and I'm joined by three fantastic panelists to discuss the future of work in the post-pandemic world. I'm going to start very briefly by asking each panelist to give a couple of lines or to introduce themselves, and then we're going to launch straight into the discussion. So could I invite Laura, please, to start?
Hello, Matthew. It's really a pleasure to be part of this great panel. So I'm Laura, and I have spent decades working in the field of environmentalism, climate change, leadership, business, and for the past many years, I have advised leaders in what we call regenerative leadership, written the book by the same name. And
I've got your book here, which I read over my holidays. So
exactly.
So we'll be talking about the book. Exactly. Who would you like to pass on to?
Hephzi.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Hephzi Pemberton, the founder of Equality Group, and we help companies embed inclusion and diversity as part of a strategic advantage and imperative. And I'm based in Oxfordshire. I will pass
deep in the heart of the
Cotswolds. In the heart of the Cotswolds, yeah. I'll pass on to Dominic.
Thank you, Hephzi. So my name's Dominic. I am a recovering chartered accountant. And that's because my parents convinced me to become one when I was living in Manchester at the age of 20. I have now recovered and I'm a work futurist, and I live and work in Sydney. Although before that, I actually traveled the world an awful lot. Last year, significantly less, spending a lot more time in my home office.
Great. Well, it's fantastic to have you all on this call. We've spoken a little bit beforehand about how we're going to be focusing on the inner dimension, in a sense, of the future of work. How are leaders and indeed workers being called to show up in different ways in the wake of the pandemic? Some of the challenges, obviously, that everyone's been experiencing during lockdown and all the uncertainties that we've faced in the last year and going ahead, but also what are the opportunities here that we could seize on to really change how we work, to fix some of the broken systems, Dom, that you've talked about, and embrace some of the principles that I know both Hephzi and Laura hold very dear. So I want to start by asking Laura, you write in your book about regenerative leadership and how, and we've spoken about how, in a sense, it was almost prophetic or prescient coming out just before the pandemic in terms of the kind of issues that it raises. Could you tell us a bit more about what regenerative leadership is and how you see it taking root in a post-pandemic world? And I will be, because we've only got 30 minutes, everyone, I will reserve my moderator's right to allocate the time equally. So please go ahead.
Regenerative leadership is this approach to doing business, but we have seen many politicians, city planners, mayors, etc., also kind of taking this on board. It's a systemic approach to leadership. So we are living in a world right now with a lot of interconnected challenges. Once we will have ridden over this pandemic, we are still facing many even more severe systemic shocks that will come in the future. So we need leaders that have that inbuilt resilience. And I think what we have seen during the pandemic is that there's a lot of inbuilt fragility in our systems. And we need leaders right now that has the ability to think in interconnected systems, but also leaders that have that awareness that my role here is to be steward, is to be holding the space for something new to emerge and let the old dying logic that has brought along a lot of this destruction be space holders for something new to beautifully emerge. Regenerative leaders has this approach that I need to heal the systems that I'm a part of, and I need to heal the ecosystems, both the inner ecosystems and the outer ecosystems. We are in the midst of not only a pandemic, but also the sixth mass extinction, runaway climate change, but also we have never been more depressed, anxious, suicide rates have never been higher. So that's something that our leaders need to take into account when they run successful businesses of the future.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? The way the pandemic has kind of come in like a tidal wave and almost washed away some of the boundaries that used to exist between work and life. I mean, we're all sitting at home. I'm guessing we're all sitting at home. You know, I've got my little daughter a few meters away in the other room. And the old sort of partitions have just been swept aside, haven't they? Which presents opportunities, but it also presents challenges. Now, I want to turn to Hephzi. You obviously work on diversity and inclusion, which also became a huge issue last year with the Black Lives Matter protests, which forced diversity up the agenda in a way that we haven't seen before. At the same time, we're in a post-pandemic situation. What are you seeing among leaders who are struggling to know how to reconcile all these simultaneous pressures that are coming in simultaneously? What do you see as a potential opportunity for them going forward?
There's definitely a much greater awareness about the need to prioritize inclusion and diversity because of the events of last year. But I think there's also a risk of some very short-termist behavior that ultimately doesn't lead to the longer-term systemic changes that Laura's been talking about, but also really doesn't serve the communities that need that serving, that have been excluded for so long. So there's a risk of sort of greenwashing in the inclusion and diversity space. And I think leaders are under-equipped. I think leaders and managers, because the middle level is also extremely important in implementation, they are under-equipped into how to actually understand this topic of inclusion and diversity, which ultimately is the S in ESG. It's about social sustainability. How do you prioritize people in your organization? So I think there's a huge need for education and training, and also redesign of systems at work to be able to do it well. But there are good case studies of firms that are doing that. I just think it takes a lot of work. It takes leadership that has to come from the top. It takes resources and budget, and it takes a long-term perspective. And all of those things have to be in play for it to start to happen.
Before I hand over to Dom, I'm feeling this alignment here in terms of what you've both been saying, Laura and Hephzi, this recognition that the system is not working. And if we could have, it was becoming pretty obvious pre-COVID. Now it's totally incontrovertible, and management are facing challenges, multiple interlocking challenges in ways that they've never seen before. Dom, is there an opportunity here, would you say? And before you speak, I would recommend everyone please watch Dom's TED Talk from January. Although when I first watched it, I saw, God, there's not many people watching this because there were very few people in the audience. I thought, oh, it's actually because everyone's socially distanced. And then the camera pans and you see
20 very keen sets of eyes staring through.
Yeah, yeah. It was a moment of thinking, wow, we have arrived in the post-COVID world. And you actually asked in the panel, didn't you? Everyone remembers the moment where, oh, this isn't just going to be 8 weeks. And like you said, it's like we've gone from a snowstorm, thinking it was a snowstorm, to recognizing that we've woken up in the ice age.
Yeah. Although let's be honest, not everyone's had that realization yet. And I think that's probably the reason you put this panel together, right? I think the rhetoric and the theory is spot on. You know, I'm just getting frustrated, not by the opportunity, but by the missed opportunities. Like, we didn't need COVID to come along to tell us that diversity and inclusion was important. Like, there's statistics on the wazoo of the fact that diverse and inclusive teams are more creative, more innovative, more profitable, more effective. You're like, cool, let's do that. And yet we haven't, right? So I think we need to understand what's that tacit barrier, which a lot of it's short-termism. And I think what COVID did was pour accelerant on what we thought was slow change. Well, big organizations, we got a few years, we'll wait. And suddenly those organizations went, damn. And it's weird because they're the same organizations that for years have said people are our most important asset. Saying that is so easy. Doing it, as many organizations have proven, is a damn sight harder. And there's a lot of leaders I've been speaking to where I say to them, for every dollar you spend on diversity, save 2 for inclusion. And you have to do that genuinely and authentically to actually create that environment. And then what we do at Atlassian is we try and measure the outcome of that, which is a sense of belonging. Because what I've seen, I think, to your point, Hephzi, on greenwashing, lots of stats that make things look great. And you're like, yeah, you're 37% female. They're all in marketing, right? That's not a good stat anymore, right? It's diversity at a team level and inclusion and a sense of belonging. But then let's be honest, right? The sad statistic, and I won't name the source because it's not Reuters, but it was reported yesterday that 140,000 jobs were lost in the US economy in December, and every single one of them was female.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've seen similar statistics coming out of the UK as well, that women are disproportionately affected by redundancies at this time. And obviously we've had huge social inequalities from who's affected by COVID when you look at that, which is really disturbing in terms of who the healthcare system is serving and who it's not serving.
No, and I think I'm glad, Hephzi, that you named that in a sense, because of course we can talk about what's happening at the top of big organizations and the challenges that executives are facing in steering into the future. But obviously the reality for so many people who are not in those positions has become very, very tenuous in the last year. And that's something that we need to acknowledge. Dom, you wrote in a blog very recently that authenticity now is in at work. What did you mean by that?
It's funny because I don't think it was ever out. Well, I hope it was never out because I've never known anything otherwise. As a young lad from the north of England, I've never known anything other than authentic. It was the only ingredients we ever got on a weekend. I think what we're seeing is there was this kind of performance to work before. So there was like innovation was all about the innovation theatre. It wasn't about creating anything new. Diversity inclusion was about some good stats. It wasn't about actually tapping into balance and belonging, right? And climate was about a good CSR report, but not caring about the planet. And I think what we're seeing now is authentic leaders say, here I am, and here's who I am as a person, and here's me being vulnerable, and here's empathy, and I'm going to role play and demonstrate these, which is funny because I think for years, what I've seen at other organizations is people reading about empathy and then regurgitating it, which is not empathy. It's the opposite of empathy, actually. And so how do we realize that not just the buzzwords of empathy and authenticity, but it's like, have a sense of belonging, be your true, authentic, the best version of you, and be comfortable being that person. Like you've got to know who you are first before you can be a good teammate. And we're passionate about teams, but we also are passionate about understanding the role of the individual in the team. And everyone should be an individual. Everyone should be different. That cognitive diversity is hugely valuable. So authenticity is key. The weird thing is, and this is a little bit meta, you've got to be authentic with it, right? But I still see so many leaders faking authenticity by trying to say the right thing, which happened a lot in Black Lives Matter, right? We saw the tokenist behavior rather than the authentic behavior.
Can I just chime in on that?
Yeah, Hephzi, please. Yes.
I think that's because a lot of leaders are very, very scared. They're very scared to get it wrong and to be caught out. And that is because of the education gap that exists. So this is a new demand. It is an absolute imperative. I totally agree with you. Being vulnerable, being authentic, showing empathy, having a growth mindset, being willing to get things wrong and learn from that. But that hasn't been the way it's been. So there have been very, this is a totally new expectation in a way that so many leaders and managers, they don't know how to do this at work. They hopefully might know how to do it at home, but maybe they don't even know how to do it at home. So, listening in on some marriages, I think it's still a development area for so many of us. So how do you create environments at work where you can practice this?
Yeah. Sorry, Hephzi. Sorry, yes. No, I was getting carried away in my recollection of that kind of viral moment. I think it was 2019 where that guy was talking on the BBC about North Korea and his kid came in and the mum runs in and it was just chaos and it was and we all loved it and it became a sensation. And then 6 months later, that was me. I'm sitting here and the door, this was the room that my daughter used to sleep in, and the door would open and she'd totter in. And the first in lockdown, I remember I'd set up a briefing with the head of the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, and Matilda was there on my knee through the whole thing. And it was like, and you could just see everyone was looking at her and not listening to anything that anyone was saying. So
I think that is quite, I think what we are witnessing right now is a collective breakdown, but also a cracking open into our heart space. Suddenly it's no longer possible to wear a mask. Suddenly leaders are being asked to face shadows and blind spots and are being forced to kind of whoa, okay, I'm being forced to stop here. What's the kind of legacy that I'm leaving behind? These systemic shocks that has been talked about for such a long time, it's suddenly real, it's suddenly tangible. How resilient is our organization? I think it's so important that we start to view societies, organizations, education systems as organisms. And for organisms to be fully healthy and full of vitality and thrivability, we need to have a focus on how is the individual cell really thriving? How is our individual employees, students, how are they thriving right now? And what are the elements what are the kind of secret sauce that needs to be in organizations, in societies, in living systems for them to thrive? That's what I talk a lot about. What can we learn from the intelligence of life, the intelligence of nature, in terms of how do we create thriving living systems? Diversity is one key element of that kind of secret sauce of how we can, as leaders, be better at not having that very rigid, mechanistic, old school logic we've been trained in, where we build our organizations like machines, like hierarchies that are incredibly fear-induced. How can we open into our next state of evolution, really?
Laura, I love what you're saying there, and I can see everyone nodding. And I know, Dom, you speak in your TED talk about legacy, exactly what you say. And what do you talk about the deathbed exercise, and even exercises that elite military teams do. I love that exercise that I wish we had time to do it now, but if you want to do the exercise, watch Dom's TED talk. But Laura, do you have an example? I mean, could you give a brief example of one of you could sort of bring, we've been talking in quite a theoretical level in a sense. Could you kind of give us a bit of a sense of the feel of what this or what happened, or an example, or a flavor of what this looks like in an organization?
I think what I have seen from my perspective is many organizations in the beginning, okay, there was this initial shock, but as you just mentioned to before, this is just a snowstorm, it will pass in a few weeks and we will be back to normal. And then there started to come this focus on maybe we are not just kind of holding on until we can go back to normal. Maybe this is a time where we need to completely reinvent our ways of being on this planet. And I'm starting to see a new approach to strategy. So some organizations have been like incredibly full of fear in terms of how can we rigidly hold on to what we know best. Let's plan our way out of this. Let's have Q1, Q2 targets, and let's have maybe slightly revised KPIs that are focusing on how can we get out of this pandemic still with a
back to normal.
Exactly. But what we are starting to witness is, okay, let's step back a bit. Let's start to view our organization as this living system, and we need to ensure we have inbuilt resiliency for us to withstand and absorb future shocks. And therefore, let's start to have conversations of how are we actually thriving? What is it for you going through this pandemic? How can we start to nurture the carrying capacity of our organizations, of our living systems, and just understand as leaders that we cannot steer through this pandemic or future shocks if our inner resilience is at a really poor state, if we are not thriving, if the cells are not responding properly, we will see cancerous cells starting to take over in our organizations as well, and we will just kind of collapse in future shocks. And that awareness leaders are getting kind of starting to be aware of that. Okay, how are we thriving? What about this increased stress levels that we are witnessing right now? Let's address that. Let's park our plans for a second now. Let's park new project rollouts and launches, and let's focus on the interconnected relationships in our organization and focus on how we can thrive better.
I want to go to Hephzi in a moment. I was wondering though, Dom, and I'm going to ask you a similar question, Hephzi. Dom, could you tell me about how you've changed inwardly during the pandemic? What have been the biggest realizations? And I know, again, I don't keep flagging your TED talk, but you say it so well. We could do it. We could go on. You could keep us hooked for quite a while on this question, but if you could give us the sort of the nub of how what shifts have happened in your own life, and what that may point to for others and what we're going to see unfolding going forward.
Yeah, two very simple or complex topics, depending on how you think about them. One is unlearning, realizing that the past is the past, like celebrate it, have a wake for it, make a poster, but move on from it, like invest the energy in the new, not the past. We can learn from it, but we can't hold on to it, right? There's a lot of heritage and history there, learn from it, don't hold on to it, it's gone. And then the second part is stop trying to guess or really the high level of certainty or confidence that many business leaders grasp after, it's not there. So instead, experiment. Yeah. Like I've spent the last year experimenting and saying to people when they're like, Dom, what do you think about X? I'm like, I don't know, but let's try something, right? I work in the field of software development. No one is going to die, right? So why not try something? If it works, do more of it. And if it doesn't, I'm going to tell everyone what went wrong so we can learn from it. And it kind of sounds simple, but there are so many leaders that I work with outside Atlassian that are just grasping for this certainty, this cloak of certainty that is not there. Like, let's embrace the fact that it's uncertain and experiment and evolve our way through it.
Yeah. Hephzi, how have you changed? Has the pandemic changed you? And if so, how?
Yes, I think I have. Well, firstly, I moved. So I moved out of London, and that was partly because of my son and just needing more space really for him. I think as a team and as a business, we've connected even more during this time, and I think that
you connected more even though you can't meet.
Yeah. So we have many more regular points of check-in through different mediums, on Zoom calls, WhatsApp, but also like writing to each other. So there's been a lot of ways that we've been able to grow even closer as a team, even though we are more remote. We were working remotely before, and actually a couple of other team members have moved too, just because of their own personal circumstances. But the business has continued to grow and been able to serve our clients with what we do. And I think that point of creating connection is really essential in times of trauma, and that's been shown that relating is one of the best ways to heal, to start to discover what healing would mean. So I think that's what we've seen as a team. That connection has been very enriching, and I've seen with clients that have been connecting more and finding innovative ways of connecting and getting that creativity, as Don was talking about, and that opportunity for reflection. Like Laura was saying, they've actually been finding the opportunity in this time, and I think we'll continue to find more opportunities because of these new behaviors and habits that have been building.
I want to share an example from Reuters on this, because we've been having life and work in the time of COVID, what I would call a sharing circle, where anyone's welcome to come all around the world, and it's facilitated, or somebody just opens a discussion and there's maybe a few people who've got something to offer to share about how they've been coping, whether it's been growing spider plants from cuttings or baking. And suddenly you have this incredible moment where colleagues who are normally in totally different teams, you may never have ever seen each other, from Palestine to Germany to the US to all around the world, coming together, not to talk about work and have another story meeting, but just talk about how they're doing. And I come away from those meetings energized. I feel so, there's some real beauty in that it's so inspiring and uplifting. Why weren't we doing that already? Why don't we just do that anyway? It's such a great, I feel like at Reuters, that is an innovation that I really hope will become part of our culture going forward. Because I see the value. And on your point about community, I have two new words from the pandemic. One is micro community, just spontaneous little groups of friends or colleagues who kind of form and support one another, as we did with a little group during lockdown. And also micro solidarity. Right, a little micro solidarity for somebody, and that whatever form that takes is just there's something, we're having to almost develop a new language, aren't we, as we enter this new age. We got about seven minutes left. Sorry, Laura, please.
I think it's about what happens when we are suddenly faced with death. We are a culture that are incredibly fearful of death. And suddenly it's everywhere, at least the energy of death, and are we dying, and what have we done to this planet? And there has been an opening into a new way of being completely vulnerable. Everything is just kind of, we need to stand there and we can't hide any longer. And I think the beauty of that, when organizations have been able to facilitate that, as you say, there's new beauty that is being revealed. Suddenly we feel more connected to not only ourselves, but also each other, because we are riding through this challenge together. And it's a very unique opportunity of advancing into the next state of our evolution as a global collective.
We've just got about 5 minutes left. So in that time, I'd love to throw this forward and think about what do you think are the kind of, how will things look different in 5 years' time? What's going to be, is it maybe in terms of working remotely, maybe in terms of how we're, what sort of jobs we're doing? I'd love us each to give a few brief thoughts on how will the future of work concretely have changed in the next 5 years? Dom, I can see you. Are you nodding because you have an idea, or because you're pensively staring into the distance?
I think about it on a daily basis as part of my role. There's a few constructs that we can challenge. We can challenge 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. They are very exclusive constructs that are quite a struggle for diversity and inclusion, as an example. Also for climate and the planet. When there's
hang on. So I have to interrupt you, Dom, because I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just love when you say in your talk that we've been working on the same model for 300 years at work. 300 years that we've been turning up to the office and hang on.
A lot of other things have changed in that time, but 9 to 5.
Quite a lot has changed. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just think
that's flexibility. Flexibility not only gives us access to a more diverse talent pool, it gives them a chance to work at the time when it's best for them, which is therefore more inclusive, better for the planet, for inclusion, for belonging, all that jazz. I think there's a few challenges, there's a few hurdles I want us to overcome really quickly. One is mental health. I think, Laura, you mentioned sort of suicide and anxiety and stress levels. Well, let's understand that mental health, we've already got over the taboo, but let's put mental health on the same bar as physical health, right? If someone wasn't looking after themselves physically, you'd have the chat. Mentally, it's still a little bit of a taboo, and I think we need to compensate there. Yeah. And also, I think we need to sign up for lifelong learning. I'm of a generation that when I finished at uni, I thought that was it. I burnt my books. I'm done. Now I work for 45 years, then I retire, then I die. And that concept is gone. And so how do we, you like micro communities, how do we sign up for micro learning and unlearning? How do we all evolve? And the education that Hephzi so eloquently mentioned, that education needs to be en masse, not just for leaders, but that frozen middle management layer. And I think if we can nail those 3 things, we can build a future work environment where we prosper. That's just part of life. It's not the reason we exist. It's just part of why we exist.
I'll maybe go to Hephzi before returning to Laura, who started us off. So Hephzi, what in the few moments we have, what do you think will change? What do you think will have really radically changed in 5 years?
Well, my hope is that our leadership will look and feel very different. So I think we should have more balance in terms of who is leading our organizations and also how they are leading our organizations. And I think the topics of invisible diversity and inclusion will continue to go up the agenda, and people will be much more aware of what that means and how they can harness it. And I think the inner work topic is, work will be just as much about the interior life and how that plays out at work and across teams. Yeah,
that's very well put. So Laura, we just have a couple of minutes left for you to give us your predictions, stare into your crystal ball and tell us what you think our lives will look like in five years or more.
I think what is making me very hopeful these days, although we are living through a very challenging time, is how the discourse has changed completely, at least in the circles that I'm a part of. Suddenly it's okay to talk about vulnerability. It's okay to talk about what am I longing for? What is my deeper sense of purpose? We see more and more leaders that are stepping away of running their organizations as rigid, fear-induced, mechanistic hierarchies, and are starting to experiment, just as Dom was also saying, let's experiment, let's just try and test out something new. It's no longer the role of the CEO to have all the answers. The role of the CEO is to be a chief ecosystem officer or a facilitator, and that facilitator mindset is so incredibly important. No one has all the answers. We are finding the answers together. So instead of viewing our employees as robots that has to come into a physical place from 9 to 5 and then clock out, it's more organic, and everyone has the opportunity, at least, to be aligned with a deeper sense of purpose in their organization, so we can unleash some of the human ingenuity and creativity and innovation from the true meaning and sense of the word, instead of just being something we put on fancy PowerPoint slides. What does it actually mean to be truly creative? And so this deeper sense of what it means to be a thriving human being on a thriving planet is what will take up much more space in the future. It has to, or else our species will go extinct. It's as simple as that.
Can I add one?
Well, you heard it at Reuters Next first. We're going from Chief Executive Officer to Chief Ecosystem Officer in the next 5 years. I'm looking forward to that moment. Thank you, Laura, for wrapping up. Hephzi, Dom, for joining us at Reuters Next. It's been a pleasure, a privilege. I've come away with some new thinking, new inspiration, and I really appreciate all the work you do. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.